as the notion of federalism in Australia seems pretty close to having collapsed down to allowing the states to decide for themselves about daylight savings time. Then coming from the daylight savings lacking Queensland at an ungodly early hour, let me tell you, in order to get to New South Wales, I can say that as someone who is a federalist and was incredibly pained having to read the work choices case, and I just about had to go to the hospital for high blood pressure when I first read the Tasmanian Dams case. It's a delight to be able to experience at first hand federalism at work in Australia, shifting daylight saving zones. So there you go. Now that's a bit facetious, but only a bit. I thought as my topic is the job of judges in a democratic society, and I only have 20 minutes, it's not the worst entree into the topic. Of course, now anytime you ask about the proper role of some group in society, say judges or elected legislators or writers, you can probably change the question and ask, how do these people want to be remembered in 100 years? And I don't know anyone who's ever answered that question better than the wonderful American travel writer Bill Bryson. We heard him speak, and when he was asked what he wanted people to be saying about him in 100 years, he answered, "Isn't it remarkable that he's still sexually active?" I have time only to make a few broad points, so let me start my talk, not here in Australia, but let me start in the UK. I think most of you will know that David Cameron, his coalition government there, they're having real difficulties with knowing how to deal with decisions from the European Court of Human Rights, which is tied to the European Convention on Human Rights, which in turn is incorporated into their statutory Bill of Rights. Pretty much the model that Mr. Brennan and the Bill of Rights advocates here want, without the international treaty side of it. Now, this European Court of Human Rights effectively, for all intents and purposes, has the last word up there on all sorts of social policy line drawing decisions, whenever those decisions can be translated into the language of human rights, which, as we're learning day by day, really isn't the most onerous of translation tasks, covers just about everything. So this court, this European Court of Human Rights, it has 46 non-UK judges, 20 of whom apparently have no prior judicial experience, which is not unheard of. The odd top barrister goes to a top court, but 20 of the 46 non-UK ones seem to have no prior judicial experience. And then many of the 46 come from countries, and now you can think of, say, Albania, Russia, Azerbaijan, countries which do not immediately spring to the top of your mind as world-class exemplars for upholding human rights. In fact, you might go so far as to say that a lot of the countries that contribute judges to this European Court of Human Rights are countries where you wouldn't even say that the rule of law really looks very evident. In fact, it's a bit of a joke in some of those countries. And this European Court of Human Rights has recently made some pretty shonky decisions, to the point that it inflamed a former House of Lords judge, their top, they changed the name to the Supreme Court, but a top British judge, Lord Hoffman, who himself has ties with Amnesty International, which just last month paid £860,000 to its two top officials. So next time you donate money to Amnesty International, you might want to realize that 4% of last year's income went to pay off their top two people. But leaving that aside, Lord Hoffman basically went into open rebellion with the European Court of Human Rights. It only happened after he retired, but there's bravery and there's judicial bravery. Now, the decision that has really stirred things up over there had to do with a man named John Hirst. He was convicted of murdering his landlady with an axe and then having a cup of coffee. And Mr. Hirst, it's Mr. Hirst who's led the drive to the European Court to win the right to vote for all incarcerated prisoners, which just recently happened, which was then followed by some of you will know, by the House of Commons. The UK House of Commons rejected the court edict, and we're left with this dilemma that Mr. Cameron has no idea what to do with. And nor does anyone else. We'll see how that plays out, but I suspect he'll cave in. Now, I'm not here this afternoon to tell you or to point out that the Hearst case was relied upon by the majority judges of our High Court and our prisoner voting case of Roach. I'm not here to tell you that, though it was. And maybe actually I will come back and say a thing or two about that. No, instead I want you to listen to the main argument that's being given up there in the UK in defense of the European Court, and by connection, the European Convention, and by extension, all of the top British judges who do what the European Court tells them to do. What is the defense of this that the bien-pensants are giving up there in the UK? Well, here's the essence of that defense, as encapsulated by a British legal academic, Francesca Klug, writing in which newspaper we don't really need to ask, The Guardian, and I quote, "Because that's what we've signed up to." Let me repeat that. Because that's what we've signed up to. Now, maybe this is going to surprise you, because for the rest of this talk, I want to take a look at that claim. And just to put your minds at ease, we're now going to move back to Australia. But I want you to think about the idea that judges ought to be interpreting important legal texts in the way that the people who drafted them and the people who originally agreed to them intended. In other words, that you're more or less bound by what you signed up to. And I actually like that. I like that. Let me repeat it. I like that justification. The problem with Klug up in the UK, the problem with her defense isn't that it's a bad rationale or a bad justification. The problem is she's just wrong on the facts. Back in 1959, no one, the Brits included, signed up to anything like what you have now. They didn't sign up to an expansive, unconstrained, judicially driven behemoth that today can be characterized as the European Court of Human Rights. The text up there today is treated as some sort of unconstraining living tree whose meaning changes and grows and, I might say, mutates in ways that only the judges get to tell us. Winston Churchill may well have suggested a European Court of Human Rights in the way that, Madison said that the judiciary was the least dangerous branch. But that's because they have no experience of what's happening today in the world. So Churchill most certainly did not suggest a body whose judges would adopt and impose on elected governments the most expansionary, democracy-crippling, democracy-encroaching interpretive approaches known to humankind. So let's just return to the job of judges then in a democratic society, and let's pick a place with a written constitution. How about Australia? Now, nobody ever asks themselves this unless they have to, but let's say that somebody says to you, what's the point of a written constitution? I mean, really, seriously, what's the point? I mean that as a serious question. Imagine, I used to live in New Zealand. It's a very attractive place to live, first place to give women the vote as a country. Maori had the, seats reserved for them in Parliament in 1867. In terms of progressive, sort of socially advanced things, hard to beat New Zealand on just about any criterion. So imagine you're living right now in New Zealand. That's a jurisdiction with no written constitution. There's not very many of those left. The UK sort of, Europe sort of ruins that, Israel sort of, and a sovereign parliament, which means all of the constraints on what parliament can do are moral and political. There is no legal or constitutional limit saying you can't do that. All right, so you're living in New Zealand. And what would someone from Australia, a person that's trying to sell you the sort of Australian model, the Australian constitutional setup, what might that person say to you, the Kiwi, was the point of shifting to a written constitutional setup like Australia's? Now, of course, one answer you might give might be in terms of federalism. If you have a big country like Canada or the US or Australia and you wanted to leave a little bit of diversity, you might answer you need a written constitution to work a federal system, which is true. The problem with that, of course, in one sense, is that our High Court has done just about everything it can to gut federalism as a working principle in this country. We have been left with massive vertical fiscal imbalance and the need for these pathetic calls for cooperative federalism. Look, if you're going to have federalism, it can't be cooperative. The only kind of federalism that works is competitive federalism. Look at Switzerland and the US, much wealthier than us. It works because you compete over tax rates, you compete over regulatory regimes. It doesn't work because you're all doing the same, but you have an extra level of bureaucracy. That's cooperative federalism. It just makes no sense at all. Competitive federalism is a very good idea. Cooperative federalism, you might as well move to a unitary state. It's better. Now, you might not be able to give that answer then. You might say, okay, well, federalism is not why we're moving to a written constitution. Another answer a lot of people give is in terms of locking in certain outcomes, related to the legislature or the executive or the judiciary. it would be misguided, but arguably you could talk about a Bill of Rights here too. So maybe you want to lock those things in so that if you change any of the fundamental aspects of your setup, you're going to need a constitutional amendment. And by the way, amending the Australian Constitution is procedurally way easier than amending the Canadian or American constitutions. So when people tell you it's hard to amend the Australian Constitution, what they mean is Australians like their Constitution, and every time you ask them in a 50% plus country in the majority, they build in a reasonableness test. So first they say there's all sorts of things Parliament can't do, but don't want to go so far. But provided what Parliament's doing is reasonable, or they say there's a substantial reason, or they don't really like to talk about this, but they mention the Europeans have this thing called a proportionality test. We'll sort of work that in. So call it a reasonableness test, call it a substantial reason, call it a proportionality test, which they take from the European court indirectly without actually having the nerve to admit it. And wouldn't you know it, the judges are now going to be able to tell Parliament that they can or can't do something, but provided what Parliament's doing is reasonable, they can do it. But who gets to decide what's reasonable? That'd be the judges. They made up the test. The test lets them decide what's reasonable. Of course, they won't be doing it alone. They'll be looking to see what they're doing up in the European Court of Human Rights, which we all want to emulate. And all of this is built on what in the actual Constitution? Directly chosen by the people. That's it. So, my Lord, I just, whenever I think about this, I think that, never has so much been owed by so many majority judges to so few words in a written text. You just add in the premise that meanings can change over time to keep pace with changing social values, and nobody ever surveys the population to find out if their values have changed. The high court judges, these ex-barristers who are, noted for having their fingers on the pulse of what ordinary Australians think, and, in terms of being surrounded by sycophants, and I say this really liking some judges, I like Lord Roger, there's some of the high court here who are just excellent, but the whole system is built to surround these people with sycophants. So they're going to tell us about changing social values. Then you throw in an unwillingness on the part of the dissenting judges to really let rip. Hayden and Hayne write great dissents, but they're not Scalia-like dissents, where he basically comes right out and says, this is illegitimate. And I think they came close, a couple of them, because they are fuming mad, but they didn't do it, and they should have done it. And then you toss in a Solicitor General who seems to accept, as every ratchet up takes place, in the next case, the Solicitor General seems to accept what happened in the last one, instead of saying, no, we don't accept Roach, and no, we don't accept the implied rights cases, but that doesn't happen. And so, it's like a bit the way I'd say President Obama is going about some of the things he's doing there. If you don't really fight your side, you've got one side in court arguing against a side that doesn't really want to win. I'm not saying that about the Solicitor General, but gee, it's just not the way I'd go about it. The same way I think the states have bungled their federalism arguments. You just got to go back and say the engineer's case was wrongly decided. It's too late otherwise. So you've got problems there. But anyway, you mix all that in, and hey, presto, you've got this jurisprudence that's built on sand, and it's divorced from original intentions, original understandings, and meanings. And it's not that originalism doesn't have big problems. It has loads of problems. But it's the least bad system if you're going to have a written constitution. And it's a jurisprudence that, wouldn't you know it, wonderful to relate. When you're writing in law, you'd say mirabile dictu, the nice little Latin phrase to make people think you're smart. And it just happens to increase the power of the judges at the point of application. And again, don't get me wrong. I don't even mind the outcomes in Roach and Roe. They don't bother me at all. I don't care if a few more prisoners get to vote, and I don't care if the electoral rolls stay open for an extra 4 days. It just doesn't matter to me, the outcomes. It's the reasoning. I massively object to the majority judges in our high court, the way they're treating our Constitution as some sort of fluid, evolving, no content document. So let me be blunt. I don't think our high court judges ought to be in the business of imposing their own first-order moral and political preferences on the rest of us, even when I agree with them. At least I don't think that's what they're supposed to be doing. So let me just finish up then by asking you this. Given the way our judges are treating the written words and their intended meaning and what people thought at the time, how many people in the room want to vote yes to any mooted new preamble as regards our Indigenous people? I mean that seriously. Does it matter how unbelievably specific the words are? Does it matter how unbelievably clear it is what the intention is? Because if you think to yourself in 4 or 5 years, the judges aren't going to interpret these words based on what they meant at the time. They're not going to interpret them based on what people approving them thought they meant. They're going to treat them as living, living tree type vehicle whose meaning can change over time based on changing social values. If you know that's the interpretive approach that's being brought to bear to the task, not only would no New Zealander ever sign up for a written Australian-style constitution, I would never vote yes to anything that changed the Constitution ever, because you just don't know what you're getting. You have no idea. So no one can know how they're going to be interpreted when the intended meanings count for next to nothing, and certainly they count for less than the latest cases coming out of Canada and Europe. So I wouldn't sign up for that. The sort of judges will interpret the written Constitution as a living tree reality. So let's put it no higher than this. If you don't want to be locked in by some document that's 100 years old, or in the U.S. 200 plus years old, well, then by all means move to New Zealand. They have quite an attractive setup there. They have democracy, their economy's tanking, but in terms of, accountability, it's pretty good. If you don't want that and you actually want a written constitution, it seems to me that by definition you're asking for certain outcomes to be locked in. Now, you're not saying those outcomes can't be changed in any way, and as I said, Australia has a very flexible amending formula. In terms of any comparative looking at how you change the American Constitution or the Canadian one, we're much more flexible than that. Some countries in Latin America, you basically can't change the Constitution. Canada will never become a republic because changing the head of state requires all 10 provinces, all 10. So Prince Edward Island, with a population of 32 million people in Canada, Prince Edward Island has about 180,000 people or something. They have a veto on changing it. It's never going to happen. And even if Prince Edward Island said yes, here's the great irony, Quebec is so angry that Canada repatriated its constitution that they have said that they will never agree to any constitutional amendments. Quebec would veto it. And if that's not ironic, nothing is. So I don't see that as an attractive option. So let me then just finish by saying I think the dissenting justices on our High Court have to become more aggressive. They've got to be less polite. They need to shift to a bit of Scalia-like indignation and start pointing out the core level democratic illegitimacy of what their fellow justices are doing. And so my last 2 sentences then will be, can you imagine what our High Court majority judges might do if anyone actually gave them a Bill of Rights, statutory or constitutional? I'll leave you with that rather terrifying thought and then throw it open to questions.